Good Sunday morning, and thank you for being a part of our class today as we continue to explore Islam. This is our third study in a series of four. We're going to be looking at Islam in a period between the middle of the 11th century, about 1055, and 1700, and look at we're seeing the direction that Islam is taking as we come toward the modern period. The purpose of these classes is to answer relevant and important questions about Islam. It is to equip all of us as Christians to interact favorably in accordance with the principles of the Word of God with our Muslim neighbors, that is to love them, at the same time to engage in profitable conversation with them that will lead them to understanding and perhaps to accepting Christ. So I do hope that you are blessed by the experience today. I do hope that what you hear is historically accurate. There's no attempt on my part to make this an attack on Islam, neither to move toward undue endorsement, but simply to set forth the facts that we all need to know, the truth that we all need to know. So may God be glorified by what is said today. And now let's begin our study as we explore Islam. There were several questions that were given to me to answer. We have dealt with some of them. I've indicated the ones that we've dealt with. I don't know that we've completely answered the questions, but the attempt has been made at any rate. If you have any further questions, certainly you may contact me. Now, this is a continuation of the questions, and the ones that are in the red type are the ones that have not been dealt with yet. We'll try to cover those at least partly today, and hopefully then next week be able to wrap it up. So today we're looking at three non-Arabian Islamic empires. Remember that a non-Arabian Islamic person adherent to the religion is called a Muslim. Muslim indicates non-Arabian. And there is this hostility that we see continuing through these centuries between Arabian Muslims and non-Arabian Muslims. And we now see the three non-Arabian Islamic empires developing, and they will be Mughal India, Safavid Persia, and the Ottoman Turks. Now, it is significant, notice the last line here in this title, that the dream of the universal empire has ended from the very beginning, from Muhammad's time, and the early caliphs, Abu Bakr and Omar and Uthman and Ali. There was this intention of expanding Islam under one government, and thus a unity between religion and state, a theocracy. But now that is broken, because now we have these three empires, and we have other areas where Muslims are living that have not formed into an empire, a nation, or maybe just a community. Let's begin with Mughal India. Interesting story about India. First of all, India was one of the first 5 original civilizations in the world. As far as we can document from historical sources, the first was Sumer, and then there was China and Egypt and India. And later on, there was the island of Crete. But India existed particularly with 2 main cities, Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. That's the early civilization, but that civilization disappeared, and there will be other empires formed. These empires, such as the Mauryan Empire, just shortly before the time of Christ, and the Gupta Empire after that, were native Indian empires. Meanwhile, Islam is growing. Before Islam took over in India, India was divided into quarreling states. Islam gradually grew in the north and established a dynasty known as the Mughal dynasty or Muslim dynasty, the capital of which was Delhi. Now, these different nations, empires, if you please, that were Muslim in orientation will put an emphasis on something. For instance, as we've discussed before, with Muhammad, as he began the expansion from out of Yathrib, out of Medina, and then with the subsequent caliphs, the idea was to expand first over all of Arabia and then out of Arabia into lands controlled by Christians. That was the concept. But we noticed last week that the third of these caliphates, the Abbasid Caliphate, put an emphasis on science, on knowledge, on culture, and not so much on military expansion. Now we're going to notice the same thing with these empires we're looking at today. They put an emphasis in a certain direction. And with India, it was on the building of great monuments. Here's a map of Mughal India. You will notice Kabul, an interesting location up at the top. And you know Delhi, you see Delhi in the middle. That dark area is the area of the Mughal Empire at first, the first part of it, 1556 to 1605. It expanded later into the south, and you see that in the lighter rose color. And you can see the proximity of India to Persia, Persia being in the blue. Now there's another map we can look at. This is a simpler map, perhaps, showing the extent of the Mughal Empire from 1605 to 1707. Now remember, the capital is at Delhi, the city of Delhi, and that the emphasis is on Indian art and architecture. And of course, the most famous example of that would be the Taj Mahal, as you see here, built by Shah Jahan. Now the founder of the Muslim India dynasty, the Mughal dynasty, is a man named Babur, 1526 to 1530. He only ruled for 4 years. He was the descendant of Timur, or Tamerlane, or Timur the Lame, who was a Turkish Mongol who founded an empire known as the Timurid Empire. It covered Afghanistan, Iran, and Central Asia in the 14th century. Now, he was Babur's third great-grandfather on his father's side. And the founder of the Mongol Empire was Genghis Khan, and he was Babur's 10th great-grandfather on his mother's side. Now, why this information about the Mongols? Well, the Mongols created the largest, the biggest empire in the history of the world. They were founded by Genghis Khan in 1162 to 1227, his dates. After he died, it was divided up among his sons and grandsons. The Khanate of the Golden Horde was in the northwest. The Chagatai Khanate was in Central Asia. The Ilkhanate in the southwest, and the Yuan dynasty, which controlled China, in the east, with its capital at modern Beijing. Now here's a map just to show you what I'm talking about. This is an enormous amount of territory, larger than the Roman Empire at its high point, and larger than any empire that the Muslims put together. Now, remember, all empires are going to put emphasis on certain things. The Mongol Empire, of course, coming from, as you see on the right, Mongolia. Genghis Khan was a Mongol. They will put the emphasis on trade. It's not religion. It is not necessarily power and control, a unifying force. It is trade that is important, and that's what sustained this great empire. You will notice that they have absorbed China, and they have taken Korea. They did not take Japan. Notice it off to the right. They tried to take Japan, but there was a wind that came up that blew the ships back. The word in Japanese for a holy wind is kamikaze. That came into play in World War II. Notice that they have taken Tibet, they have taken Persia, they have taken Russia, and all the way into Europe. It's an enormous empire. You can see the Great Wall, and this is the boundary of the Chinese Empire, which was controlled by Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan. Now, what about the religion? One reason for presenting this is the fact that they were never, as a whole, committed to the Islamic religion. Mongols did not consider one religion to be necessary, therefore they were accepting of many religions. For instance, there was Tengrism, which was an animistic Turco-Mongol religion based on the sky god. Shamanism, which is very primitive pagan religion. Buddhism, which originated in India, but became popular in the Far East. And also Nestorian Christianity and Islam. All of this varied by region. And that will help us understand that Mughal India was Muslim, but never strongly so. Now, from Babur, we come to his grandson. There was a emperor ruling in between, not of consequence, but Akbar is the most significant of the Indian emperors, 1556 to 1605. Grandson of Babur, he spread Islam southward, very capable, gained popular support. Was he a Muslim? Yes, but he was a different kind of Muslim. He was, we might say, an eclectic Muslim. He took the best of several religions. He incorporated Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism and various other religious ideologies, and put together a synthetic religion, combination of many. Therefore, he was tolerant. Now, let me use the word tolerant here in a different sense. Last week, when we talked about tolerance in the caliphates, tolerance was the practice of allowing dhimmi, people of the book, to live peacefully in a Muslim country, in the empire. It was the one empire at that time. They were forced to pay the jizya, the tax. They were not able to evangelize. They could not convert other people, particularly could not convert Muslims to Christianity. They were second-class citizens. That is considered tolerant in the mainstream of the Islamic religions and empires. But for India, Akbar's viewpoint was really, in our understanding of the word, extremely tolerant. To him, it really didn't make any difference what religion you practiced. And his religion, which he didn't impose upon people, but he advocated it, was simply made up of all these other religions. So it didn't become a major factor to him. And of course, there were Christians in India at this time, and still are today. Akbar was a good ruler. He centralized the government. So he put an emphasis on good government, on quality oversight of the government. Now, later, he's followed by Shah Jahan, 1627 to 1658. He's the one who built the Taj Mahal, which you see here. But Muslim India began to decline after the reign of Aurangzeb. He is the last important Mughal emperor, 1658 to 1707. What happened? Trade happened. Remember that Mongols had emphasized trade. Their activities during the high point of their regime, which is going to extend from the 1200s to the 1300s, but they left behind, as they declined, a strong network of trade. And by the time we come into the 15th century and the 16th century, we begin to see European countries engaging in trade. Portugal and Spain and the Netherlands, the Dutch, and the French and the British. And the British will focus on India, along with some other points of interest for them. They established the British East India Company. Now, this is a private company. It is not connected with the government. They're engaged in trade. So they went to India. Of course, they're looking for spices and things of that nature. And they established what they call factories. These were more like warehouses, or they were places where goods were bought and sold. And they claimed that they needed to secure the area. So they demanded from the local authorities more and more land in order to make their factories secure. By this time, the central government is weak and they have to negotiate with local Indian leaders, Maharajas, and they succeed in taking land by various means until they came to control all of India. They expanded their trading factories, warehouses, areas, districts for trade. They expanded those to the point that they took over all of India, expanding the area around factories for security purposes. And when they did finally control all of India, in 1858, in the name of Queen Victoria, the British government took over India from the East India Company, claiming, of course, corruption on the part of certain of their governors. And that was a condition of India until the end of World War II. And because of the pressure put on them by people like Mahatma Gandhi, the British finally agreed to leave. They warned Indians that once we leave, there will be civil war because the Muslims and the Hindus will fight. Gandhi's answer was, yes, that's true, but it will be our fight. And they did have a civil war. And the Muslims formed the nation of Pakistan and they broke away, and the Hindus formed India as it is today. However, there are Muslims living everywhere, in every village, in every town, in every city in India today. Now, Muslim India never expanded outward. They focused internally. That will take us to our second empire, and that is Persia. Ismail Safavi, 1487 to 1524, founded the Safavid dynasty in Persia and built it into a strong, if not an empire, a strong kingdom. Now, Ismail Safavi was a Shiite Muslim. Already we've talked about the split between the Shiites and the Sunni and the hostility that existed between them. Ismail Safavi was a Kurd and Persian mix, Kurdish Persian. He claimed to be a descendant of the seventh Imam. Now, Shiites are divided into seveners and twelvers. The seveners believe there were 7 imams, and that was the end of the line of imams, and the twelvers believe there were 12, and they believe there will be coming a messiah at some point. And Safavi said he was a descendant of the 7th imam and the line of Muhammad. Shiites believe that nations should be ruled by people who come from the line of the prophet of Muhammad. But something else about Ismail Safavi. He belonged to a unique Shiite sect. It was a sect that combined Shiite theology with Sufi mysticism. Safaviya it is called. And that made Persia just different from any other Shiite community. And Ismail Safavi will continue the Mongol and Timurid pattern of civilization. Now, the greatest ruler of Safavid Persia was Shah Abbas I. And I would just say at this point that the Persians have always been proud of their tradition that goes back into the ancient world, when they were able to almost to defeat the Greeks. And they were able to stave off the Romans. Romans never conquered Persia until, as we saw last week, the time of Heraclius in the 15th century. But the greatest ruler is Shah Abbas, 1588 to 1629. He is the dynasty's most prolific builder and patron of the arts. So you see the direction of the emphasis in Safavid Persia. And I took this quote off of a source, but I think it's a good quote. Collectively, the Safavids produced one of the richest eras of art production in Islamic history, spanning arts of the book, exquisite textiles, think of Persian carpets, and monumental architecture. So you see their focus is on the production of artistic endeavors, textiles, manufacture, beautiful things, not on war, not on expansion. Safavid Persia began to decline after the reign of Hussein I, 1694 to 1722. He appropriated state money on himself and bankrupt the state treasury. And consequently, the state collapsed. It was taken over by Afghanistan. Now, of course, there is ongoing conflict with the Ottoman Empire, and the Persians were forced to defend themselves against the Ottomans, who were expanding. We'll talk about them in just a second. But the Ottomans never took Persia. They never took Tabriz, which is the city that is the gateway city to Persia. And so Muslim Safavid Persia never expanded, but focused internally, also, of course, had to on the Ottomans. Now let's come to the Ottoman Empire. They were established by Osman, or Othman, 1290 to 1326. You see his picture to the right. There had been other Turks there earlier. We've talked about them before because they came in the early 11th century. And the first Turks there were the Seljuk Turks. And they will work with Abbasid caliphs and eventually cause a great problem and eventually take over. They took over by 1055 and dismissed the caliph. However, the Ottomans are going to come later. So the Seljuks are pretty much in control from the 11th century into the 13th century. They do not put together a great dynamic empire. They control land, but they do not become the kind of aggressive nation that the Ottomans will. And the Ottomans settled in the city of Bursa. See a picture here to the right. It's called the Green City. It's a very beautiful city. It was built by the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. And so they took over this city, and that's their headquarters. And if you go there, you will see that they have the tombs of their first sultans built there, and you're looking at one of them in that picture. And then the Ottomans, once they established themselves at Bursa, expanded until they were able to control all of the territory of what we call Anatolia, the territory that once was Abbasid, is no longer, and then was Seljuk. And so this group of Turks, the Ottoman Turks, take over all of that territory, but now they are expansive. Their emphasis is on war and taking over and converting people. And so of the three empires that we're looking at today, it is only the Ottoman Empire that had this agenda. Now, the first significant step they took in moving toward Western Europe, and their goal is to take Western Europe, was to defeat the Germans, that is the Holy Roman Empire. That took place in 1396 at Nicopolis, which is in Greece. The emperor was the Emperor Sigismund. He was defeated soundly, and he simply packed up his army and went back home. And the Ottomans had a great victory. But the greatest of all, perhaps, not only strategically, but psychologically, would be the fall of Constantinople. And I cannot emphasize too greatly how the significance of this, because this is the capital of the Roman Empire. Remember, Rome moved its capital in 330 to Constantinople, which they built up. There was a city there before called Byzantium, and they built it into this great, beautiful, monumental city of Constantinople and ruled from there for over a millennium. And the idea was that Constantinople could never fall, but it did. Muhammad II, who was 21 years old when he took the city, you see a picture of him on the right, he was dedicated from the very time he was a child. His great goal in life was to take Constantinople. He succeeded on May 29th, 1453. And among Greek people today, that is considered an unlucky day. People do not get married on May 29th. It is a day of shame. And because it was on a Tuesday, Tuesday is also among Greeks considered to be unlucky. The campaign started on April the 9th, 1453. It continued for 7 weeks as they pounded on the walls of the city before they were able to take it at 1 o'clock in the morning, 1:30 o'clock in the morning on May 29th, 1453. This is a picture showing what was a great disaster for the Roman Empire, for the Byzantine Empire, and a great victory for the Ottoman Turks. You see in the picture the walls of Constantinople, today that is known as Istanbul. Those walls, for the most part, are still standing today. They are magnificent walls. They were built in the 5th century during the reign of the Emperor Theodosius II, 408 to 450. They withstood all kinds of assaults. Their towers built all along there where a person approaching the city would be in view of soldiers on 2 towers at one time, at any time. Actually, there were 3 walls. There was kind of a berm, an earth embankment that one had to cross first. There was a second wall, and then there was a moat. And if one got over the first 2 walls and the moat, then they were caught between the second and third wall, and the third wall is the one you see here. There was virtually no hope for an army in that position until the Turks. And they had the awesome weapon of gunpowder, which they're using here. And you see in this drawing, Greek fire. We talked about Greek fire last week, that secret substance that the Byzantines had, and they defended themselves for centuries. They are here catapulting the substance over the walls, you see it. And when it struck something, it would cause it to burst into flame. But the Muslims kept pounding away until they finally broke through the wall for the first time it ever happened. And when they got in, people saw the Turkish flag flying at various places. The emperor, the last Roman emperor, Constantine XI, took off his imperial insignia and just simply fought with his men and obviously died with them. And Constantinople was taken. And this is something that people just thought could not happen. Now, one reason that they were so successful was besides the gunpowder and the cannon, would be the Janissaries. The Ottomans had this unique elite military unit. They were composed of people whom they captured, kidnapped from Christians as boys. They were small boys. They would kidnap them and take them away from their family. They never knew their family. And so they had no allegiance to a family, only to the Islamic religion and to their military unit. And they were trained to become excellent warriors, excellent soldiers, and very dedicated Muslims. Now, over time, the Janissaries felt so proud of their unit that they wanted their sons to be Janissaries. But there was a problem with that. If their sons became Janissaries, they would have a definite familial connection. And that would weaken the fighting edge, so to speak. And that is exactly what happened. When the sons could become Janissaries, the effect and the success of the Janissaries ended. And one of the first great sultans of Ottoman Turkey is Selim the Grim. He advanced against Persia, against Syria, and against Egypt. Did not take Persia, however, Syria and Egypt will fall. The Ottoman Empire reaches its height under Suleiman the Magnificent, or Suleiman the Lawgiver, 1520 to 1566. He will defeat Louis of Hungary in 1526. And in 1529, he will place a siege on the city of Vienna. Now, after the fall of Constantinople, the only city that stands between the Ottoman Empire and all of Western Europe is the city of Vienna. And so they pounded away at the walls of Vienna. At this time, the Holy Roman Emperor was Charles V. He was forced to take his attention off Martin Luther, who was seeking to be accepted his Augsburg Confession to be accepted and be free to be able to teach the doctrine of justification by faith. And had Charles been able to focus his efforts and his attention fully on Martin Luther, the Reformation would never have happened. But he was forced to deal with Suleiman, and he was forced to deal with this siege on the city of Vienna. He was able to save Vienna, but in the consequence, the Reformation advanced. Maybe you can see the hand of God in this activity. But Suleiman went on to take Belgrade in Serbia, to take Rhodes, the island off the coast of Turkey, and he drove out the Hospitallers, the Knights of St. John, and they went to Malta after that. They began to decline, though, under Selim II, 1566 to 1574, and one of the signs of that decline was the Battle of Lepanto, which was a naval battle in which a number of Western European nations took part, and they were able to successfully defeat the Muslims, the Ottomans. And then there was this great siege again at Vienna, 1529, the first one, and now we have the one in 1683. This one at Kahlenberg Mountain, just outside the city of Vienna. And they hoped at this time just to put all of their forces together and focus them on a siege, just like they did Constantinople, that would overcome Vienna and enable them to enter into Western Europe and to expand the Ottoman Empire into all of Europe. It was a desperate time for the Viennese, but they were aided by the King of Poland, John III Sobieski. He did not want to see this happen because, of course, Poland would be overrun if Vienna and Austria were overrun. So he sent his forces, and with the help of John III Sobieski, they were able to fend off the attack from the Ottomans. Interesting thing, was in Vienna one time, and actually we were on a train riding back from Poland to Vienna, and there was a Polish lady, and she said to me, "Do you know the name of our train? All the trains in Europe are named, and this train happened to be named Sobieski." And she commented on the fact that Sobieski had been instrumental in saving Vienna and thus all of Western Europe. And of course, had that not happened, likely Western Europe would have become Muslim. Each time we went to Vienna on one of these programs, we would go to Kahlenberg as kind of an outing in the nice days of early fall. And then we would hike down from Kahlenberg through the vineyards to Neusdorf and then back to Vienna. But at Kahlenberg, there is a plaque with the name of Sobieski that commemorates him. And I noticed, just doing a little research yesterday, that they had planned for a great monument to go up there, but it didn't. There was controversy over it, and it isn't today. But some other things that happened from the Kahlenberg siege. Most of you are familiar with the crescent roll. But the crescent roll originated to commemorate the Battle of Kahlenberg. It was an attempt to make fun of the Turks, because the crescent is their emblem, it's on their flag. And thus they showed great disrespect and contempt for the Ottomans by making a roll that you would eat, thus devouring, so to speak, symbolically the Turks. But also coffee. We drink coffee. The spread of coffee was a result of the Turks who had coffee. They had developed, they got it from Kaffa by means of trade. And the Viennese soldiers, after they had driven off the Turks, went out and inspected the tents to see what they could take, what they could find, and they found this drink. They took it back into Vienna, and today, of course, it spread all over the world from that. And today in Vienna, there are coffee houses all over the city, and that becomes a great tradition for Viennese. But this is the final attempt of the Ottoman Empire to take the West. And here you see a picture of it. You go to the city of Vienna today, you'll see that all over the city. They continue to celebrate it. In the background, you can see the walls of Vienna and buildings in Vienna, such as St. Stephen's Church. And up close to the wall, you'll see the tents of the Muslims. And of course, the battle itself, as the Poles and the Viennese fought with the Ottoman Turks. Now, after this, the Ottoman Empire definitely began to decline. There were a series of 12 wars fought between the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, 12 of them between the 16th and the 20th centuries. It was one of the longest series of military conflicts in European history. And except for two instances, a war in 1710, 1711, and the Crimean War in the middle of the 19th century, which is often treated as a separate event, these conflicts ended disastrously for the stagnating Ottoman Empire. And on the other hand, these events show the ascendancy of one particular European nation, actually European and Asian, that is Russia, but ascending as a European power. After the modernization efforts of Peter the Great, who moved the capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg, which he built, he did that in the early 18th century. And then the Battle of Second Mohawks, 1697, Austria will regain Hungary and Transylvania, Transylvania being in Romania, and they did so with the help of Eugene of Savoy, or Eugen of Savoy, the builder of the Austrian Empire. He was, of course, not an Austrian. He came from Italy, from Savoy, but he dedicated himself to building this empire. And of course, the Austrians were very grateful for him. He's still remembered in Vienna today. His palace is still there. The Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Empire became known as the sick man of Europe after this event. And the balance was shifting. Up to the mid-18th century, the mid-1700s, relations were of equal strength. But after that, particularly after 1700, really, the advantage lay with the West. And the gap in technical skills grew wider. And there was a decline in scientific knowledge in the Muslim world. The threat of plague and the threat of famine, which had been such a scourge in Europe, had ceased by this time. And Europeans had improved their techniques of ship construction. And so things went badly for the Muslims after 1700. And some scholars look at this situation and say there were one of three things that Muslims would do in reaction to that when they saw things going downhill for them. First, they might conclude that this is just simply the will of Allah. They will always agree that what happens is the will of Allah. They have a very fatalistic view. But they might conclude that this is Allah's will and they'll just go along with it. Now, very few choose this option. You can look today at several Islamic nations that, like Dubai, to some extent Turkey, who have chosen to go along with the West. But the second option would be to conclude that Allah is punishing them and they just simply need to endure it as punishment. But the third option was to conclude that Allah is punishing them and they should do something about it. They should return to their old ways, that Allah is displeased with their departures from strict Islamic teaching. And this leads to fundamentalism and it leads to the jihad, the terror tactics. And as an example of that third option, we see a Shah in Delhi, Waliullah, who in 1703, following Aurangzeb, who taught that rulers should rule in accord with the precepts of Islam, that Islam should be purified by the ijtihad. Ijtihad is very similar to scholastic measures, where you examine a doctrine, look at the pros and cons, and scholars will go over it with the fine-tooth comb, so to speak, until they have refined it to a perfection in their judgment. And it should be done by teachers on the basis of the Quran and the Hadith, and that the four different madhabs, that is schools of thought, legal schools of thought within fiqh, which is Islamic jurisprudence, should be merged with a single system of morality and law. And I mentioned several times that the Sufis would always cause great problems for strict Muslims because they had no particular boundaries and because they would relate with the mystics of other religions, including Christians and Jews. And so they wanted to control the devotions of the Sufis. And then another example of that third option is Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab. And he lived the same time, 1703 to 1792, 18th century. He taught that Muslims should return to the teaching of Islam as understood by the followers of Ibn Hanbal, one of the great scholars of Islam from the Middle Ages, who was noted for a very strict interpretation of Islam. And they should therefore have a strict obedience to the Quran and to the Hadith, as interpreted by respected scholars of each generation. And they should reject all illegitimate innovations. This is going back to the way they were. This is a retreat. This is fundamentalism. And the Wahhabi reforms, for example, curtailed much of the Sufi devotions and the practice of reverence to dead saints. And Wahhabi combined his efforts with Muhammad ibn Saud of Diriyah to form a state. Of course, that state is Saudi Arabia. They claimed to live under the guidance of Sharia, and they tried to bring these pastoral tribes in Arabia, which had always been resistant of organization, under their rule. And thus they rejected the claims of the Ottomans to be the protectors of Arabia. Once again, something that is weakening the Ottoman Empire, and in this case, strengthening the cause of Islamic fundamentalism. Now, meanwhile, the Europeans are advancing. They have advanced in the art of navigation. They have developed trade. Countries are, and we mentioned before, like Portugal and Spain and the Dutch and the French and the English. And the greatest danger, though, to the Ottomans does not come from these trading countries of Western Europe. It comes from the Russians. And the Russian government organized itself with time of Peter the Great along Western lines, and we're proceeding south. And so the Ottomans lost territory to Russia in 1718. The decisive war with the Ottomans, 1768 to 1774, at which time Russia took control of Crimea. They have recently taken control of Crimea again. But the importance of Crimea is that it gives them a port on the Black Sea. And a port on the Black Sea would give them access through the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus into the Mediterranean and all of the trade of the Mediterranean. Russia was just yearning for that, and they finally got it. Of course, with St. Petersburg, they have a port on the ocean, but now they have the port that links them to the Mediterranean. In the East, the downfall of the Muslim Mughal Empire in India is going to be to the advantage, of course, of Russia and the presence of Europeans in the trade in the Far East. All of this is combining to weaken the Ottomans. So after 1700, the Ottomans failed to take Persia. They'd failed to take Austria. They continued to decline. They had failed to conquer Russia. Russia was advancing. Western European nations established footholds in the Middle East, various places, especially the Maghreb, that's the North Africa. And when World War I comes, the Turks chose the wrong ally. And that meant they ended up on the losing side at Versailles when the treaty was made. Now, after World War I and after the Treaty of Versailles, the Treaty of Sèvres that you see at the bottom line, actually the Ottomans were gone. And this gave a great opportunity for the Greeks who moved into what is now Turkey, Anatolia. They were going to take back their territory, which had been taken from them by the Seljuk Turks. However, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, or father of Turkey, was able to defeat the Greeks and made Turkey a secular republic. Today, it's tending to move more in the direction of being a fundamentalist Islamic state, but for many years, it's a very secular republic. And as far as the rest of the Ottoman Empire is concerned, France and England simply took over after World War I and appropriated the various areas of the Ottoman Empire to themselves. And you see here a map. All of this map is the extent of the Ottoman Empire. You see it's huge, not as big as the Mongol Empire, but very big, bigger than the Roman Empire. And all of that territory is now lost. And emerging from it, of course, is Turkey, which claims to be a continuation of the Ottomans. So what happens to Islam when the state is gone? Well, I took this quote from Mr. Hines' history. Islam is far more than a religion. It is a political as well as a religious ideology. More specifically, Islam is an ideology based in theocracy. Theocracy is the government of a state by immediate divine guidance or by officials who are regarded as divinely guided. Islam teaches it is incumbent upon all Muslims to conquer and bring into submission the entire world. And that will be a kind of a segue to lead us to our consideration next week, which we're going to be dealing with the question of where do we go from here? Where does Islam go from here? What about our relationships with Muslims in the future, today and in the future? Thank you for being a part of our class today. I hope it's been profitable for you. I invite you to be with us next week as we conclude the study, and certainly pray for all of you that the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God our Father, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit will be with you all.